Today we're actually covering a hot topic, and that's our buyer agents becoming obsolete. With the rise of online tools that any buyer can use to look at properties from their own computer or their phone, has the traditional outlook of a buyer's agent actually become something that we no longer need in the real estate industry? So let's get into it. So first of all, let's talk about the new tech that sort of changed how buyer's agents work. A long time ago, when you wanted to see a property, you would actually approach a brokerage and you would visit with the brokerage and go see all of their available properties. This was before realtor.ca, before the MLS, and this allowed you to see only specifically properties that agent wanted to see. In other words, the agents had access to all of the information that you didn't. That changed when they came out with the MLS, and websites like the realtor.ca actually began to piggyback off of that. And because of that, you're actually able to access some of the information that only the agents used to have. So this has empowered the buyer more than ever, but does that mean that realtors as a buyer agent are no longer necessary? So before we jump to some conclusions on whether they're needed or not, let's go over what they actually do. Aside from opening the door to get you into properties, buyer agents help you with negotiations, guide you through all of the paperwork and relative legislation that is applied to the property, and they provide local expertise and insights into the current market and specifically the house you're going after. And so all of those things summed up, they do seem pretty essential in any transaction, especially when you consider representation. Okay, and recently there's been a lot of criticism against buyer's agent because a lot of them have been criticized as just a means to getting into the property, when it sort of feels like a car salesman. And so if you've never bought a car from a car dealership before, typically what happens is you show up and you talk with a car salesman who's representing your interests, and you negotiate with them saying what you want. They write it down on a piece of paper, they go talk to their manager and negotiate with them, and then they come back to you and say, this is what the manager said. And it's intentionally designed that way because they sort of want a good cop and a bad cop. Somebody who is saying no to everything you want, and somebody who is cheering you on. And if you've ever done it before, it feels like they're in cahoots, and that's because they are. They both work at the same company, they both profit from the same deal. Real estate is not that, because often the buyer's agent and the listing agent aren't affiliated. Sometimes they are, but we're ignoring the situation where it's from the same brokerage, because those typically aren't as common as just a regular real estate transaction. But there's a couple of key differences in a real estate transaction that allow you as a buyer to benefit from having a buyer's agent compared to the car salesman technique. Now, I will say a lot of the criticism I actually understand. It's directed towards realtors, and that's because there has been a lot of new realtors who have joined the industry in the last few years. This isn't a new thing, but every year there's a revolving door of realtors that leave and enter the industry. There's estimates that around 75% of realtors fail within their first year, and so the chances are, if you're working with a realtor, it might be their first year, and that person might be out of business in a year because they weren't good enough to make it in the business, right? And so you could see how a bunch of people failing at an industry could really leave a bad reputation on the industry as a whole, because so many people enter into it, they do a bad job, they leave it, but in that process, there's people that are affected by the people who did a poor job at what they were supposed to do. And this has caused a lot of criticism to fall on the buyer agent specifically, because listing agents are generally agreed upon that they're needed. Okay, and for this video, I'm actually not pulling any punches here. I want to talk about all the hard-hitting questions. And one of the top questions that I get when I'm talking with somebody, or even some of my friends who are considering buying a home, is why shouldn't I just work with the listing agent directly? And it's actually a matter of a contractual obligation from the seller and the listing agent. See, the listing agent actually has a fiduciary obligation to get the seller the most amount of money possible for the transaction that they can. And you as a buyer, when you approach a listing agent in that situation, you are not walking into a situation where you have a lot of leverage or favorable conditions, because if something happens, usually they're going to pull for the listing or the seller's side. And so if you still think it's favorable to just work with the listing agent and not have a buyer agent represent your best interest, I would just encourage you to ask yourself the question, what advantage are you creating for yourself by working directly with the listing agent? And some countries and provinces have actually gone far enough to make this not acceptable, and so you can't double-end a deal. For example, in the province of British Columbia, you can't represent both the buyer and the seller because it's a conflict of interest. And to me, that makes way more sense that it's a conflict of interest for you to be working with the listing agent who represented the seller first, than it does to bring your own representative representing your interest to a potential transaction. And I understand that a lot of people think, well, the buyer agent gets paid from the seller, and so it's a conflict of interest for me because they're getting paid from the deal closing. But I would also rebuttal that with the fact that the buyer agent gets paid from a deal closing, not specifically that one. The listing agent also has a vested interest in selling that property that you're trying to negotiate with, because they get paid from that listing specifically. They don't get paid if you buy something, they only get paid if you buy that thing. And to me, that's a bigger conflict of interest than a buyer agent getting paid for you buying something.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
So to answer the question if buyer agents are still relevant, I think it's important to consider the pros, which is that you get equal representation from your own party, who is then contractually obligated to seek out your best interests. And if they aren't, there's legal repercussions to that. You could help with somebody who has experience negotiating with real estate. They have expertise on specific items. They can spot things that you might have missed. And occasionally, realtors get pocket listings, they get off-market deals, they network with a lot of other agents, and so they actually get opportunities that might not hit the market. Okay, and it seems to me like the general consensus is the biggest con is that a buyer agent gets paid a lot for what they do. And I think that's true for a lot of them, but not across the industry as a standard. A lot of bad apples get paid for doing absolutely nothing, just showing up and saying, what do you want to do? Here's the paperwork, sign it, let me know what you want to do, etc. And I don't think that's a good model of business. And those are the realtors who typically go out of business within that first year or within the first 5 years of operating. And so because of that, they've left a really bad reputation on the industry. And so to me, if that's the biggest con, it's not such a big con for you as a buyer, because you can interview other agents and find the right agent who's going to be worth the money that they're making. Plus, it's no dime out of your pocket. So buyer agents are free to you most of the time. Occasionally, sometimes there's finder's fees if they find a specific property off market, but ignoring that, a buyer agent is at no cost to you. And so it seems like a no-brainer to bring somebody who's looking after your interests in a transaction. And so while online tools are making it easier to find properties, I think it's still prudent to have a buyer agent help you along, guiding you in that process of buying a new home. So if you're in the market for finding a new place, having a knowledgeable agent can be a huge game changer and make the process way more stress-free. And so if that's you, reach out to me and I'd love to work with you today. So if you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave some comments on what you think about buyers agents, if they're still relevant in this current market, and I'll see you in the next video.